Well, good morning, everybody. Again, just as a reminder, if you want to follow along in your paper Bibles, by all means do that. And on the screen, but we do use the YouVersion Bible app. And so if you use that application on your phone or tablet, if you open that up and go to events, you can find our service in there and follow along. Well, we want the best, don't we? I think most of us are wired this way. We want the best relationships, whether that's the friendships that we have with those around us, or the best marriage if we, that's a desire for us. We want that. Maybe we want the best work experience. Perhaps for some of us, we want the best toys. That new truck, or the new car, or the boat, or the snowmobile. Some of those things that we call pleasure crafts. Or maybe for some of you, you want the best body. We want the best. And you might even have a picture of what the best looks like. You probably do. Either painted in your mind or maybe even a poster on the wall. And so, how's it going? Are you experiencing that? Is the best something you can say that's a part of your reality? Yes? No? Well, if no, one of the reasons for that might be because of this. Because while we want the best, we also want it easy. See, as soon as we realize that we're going to have to pay for it, as soon as we realize that there's going to be a degree of suffering here, as soon as we realize that it's going to be hard, we tap out. Because we want the best, but we also often want it easy, which is exactly why right about now, there's been people that joined the gym January 1st as part of a New Year's resolution. They paid their dues in January, but already they refused to pay their dues in February. They're out. But we say we want the best, don't we? Do you? Well, the best is not usually our picture of things. The best is not what we think. The best is what God says. And as people of faith, we need to know that. The best is what God says. And all through Scripture, what God does for us is He paints these pictures for us of what the best is. In all these areas of life that He has for us. And yet, just like other things, we may see the picture of God's best and we want the best. And yet, typically, as usual, we also want it easy. And so we find ourselves wandering in this gap between seeing what God's best is and actually living it. We're stuck. And we're always going to be stuck. We're always going to be hovering around the edge of experience without this one thing in our life. See, we need courage. We need courage to move past the edge to actually experiencing these things. Maybe courage is the thing that's missing. Is that what it is? Are you not experiencing God's best because you are not a person of courage? And we've been in a series called Hijacked. We've been looking at all the things that culture has hijacked from the church. And you've stuck it out because there's been some pretty tough things to hear. And yet I think we can all agree on all of these things, and especially the one today, the fact that culture has hijacked what courage looks like. I think of my grandfather. He's going to be 102 years old in just a few months from now. And when my grandfather was in his mid-20s, he was fighting World War II. He's in his early 20s, and he's fighting World War II, something truly courageous. And yet, the vast majority of young people today, I think, have dumbed down courage to their social media feeds. And I ask myself the question, how in the world does a tweet or a Facebook post come anywhere near what true courage is supposed to look like? See, I think we've confused what courage is. The culture has hijacked it from us. And I think, yes, it's even happened in the church. This lack of what true courage really is has seeped into the church. And yet God's best is going to be missed when courage is. That's the difference. Courage is the difference between seeing God's best and actually living it. And so, how does courage move us there? How does courage move us from simply seeing God's best to actually living in it? That's the question that we're going to answer today. And we're going to answer that question by looking at an old story in the Old Testament found in Numbers 13 and 14. And just to set the story up for us, this happens just after God had very powerfully used Moses to accomplish the Exodus. And so we can read all about the Exodus in the second book of the Bible called Exodus. And what happens here is God uses Moses very powerfully to deliver his people out of slavery from Egypt. 400 plus years of slavery. And now God has delivered them. The Exodus occurs. And now these people, we find them wandering in the desert. And yet God's plan is not to keep them in the desert, because he is leading them somewhere. And God is leading them to the place that he calls the Promised Land, a land that he says will be flowing with milk and honey. That's the promise these people get. And so we read that promise in the book of Exodus, like in Exodus chapter 3, verse 15. That's promised to God's people. In Exodus 13, verse 5, okay, the promise is you're going to go to a land and it's going to be flowing with milk and honey. And that picture of a land flowing with milk and honey is this image for us of this never-ending production or never-ending produce of God's best. And so God's desire is to move his people into not just seeing the best, but actually being able to walk in the best and to live in God's best. And so when we pick up that story in Numbers chapter 13, in verses 1 to 20, God has selected one leader from each of the 12 tribes of Israel to be spies. And he basically looks at these 12 spies who are leaders of each of the 12 tribes and just says, now go and see it. Just go take a look. Go and see it. And so in Numbers 13, verse 17, it says, when Moses sent them to explore Canaan, he said, go up through the Negev and on into the hill country. See what the land is like, and whether the people who live there are strong or weak, few or many. What kind of land do they live in? Is it good or bad? What kind of towns do they live in? Are they unwalled or fortified? How is the soil? Is it fertile or poor? Are there trees in it or not? Do your best to bring back some of the fruit of the land. It was the season for the first ripe grapes. And so God says this, just go see it. Just go take a look. And it took them 40 days to get a full picture of what this was. Okay, 40 days for them to just take a look to get that picture of what God had for them. And then in verse 27, this was the report. They gave Moses this account. We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here is its fruit. And so for 40 days, they just go and take a look, and they come back, and they say, it's true. It's true. Okay, God promised us a land flowing with milk and honey, and it does. It is the best. That's the conclusion. We have seen the best. God is going to bring us into the best. But there's a problem. The problem is, while it's the best, unfortunately, it's not going to be easy. And so here's the conclusion of some of these men in verse 28. But the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw descendants of Anak there. It's the best, but unfortunately, it's just too hard. We saw giants there. That's who Anak is. Okay, the people of Anak were these giants. In Deuteronomy chapter 9, verse 2, it says, the Anakites are strong and tall. Who can stand against them? And yet, that's God's best. And God's best is going to be missed when courage is. See, courage is the difference between seeing God's best and actually living it. So how does courage move us? Move us there. How does courage move us from seeing it to actually living it? Well, we can see some things from this story that are very important for us. The first thing is that courage can see beyond current perception to live in God's future promise. That's what courage does. Okay, courage helps us see beyond the perception of things into living God's future promise. See, the perception, and that's all it was that this is just way too hard. 10 of the 12 leaders declared that. This is just going to be way too hard. I mean, we saw giants there. Now, do we have giants today? Well, when I was growing up, there was a giant named Andre. Maybe you remember Andre the Giant. And if you watched wrestling, back in the day, there was this man named Andre called the Giant. And so just think, there's Andre the Giant next to a normal-sized person. So just imagine these people seeing nothing but Andre the Giant. That's all they see. Hey, all these people are absolutely gigantic. And so they say, it's just way too hard. It's going to be way too hard. That's the perception. And most people believed it. In chapter 14, it says, that night, all the members of the community raised their voices and wept aloud. All the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole assembly said to them, if only we had died in Egypt or in the wilderness. They just started to grumble and complain. In chapter 14, verse 27, God himself says, how long will this wicked community grumble against me? I have heard the complaints of all these grumbling Israelites. You know what's easy? What's easy is to be discouraged because of the perception of things. And most people are. It's very easy to discourage people. Just show them how it looks in our eyes. But not everyone is there. So there's a man named Caleb. And Caleb actually believes God's promise. He actually looks to living in that future promise. And so in chapter 13, verse 30, after all this grumbling and complaining, Caleb says this. He says, then Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, we should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it. See, for Caleb and a young man with him named Joshua, and we hear that he was with Caleb, courage wasn't missing for them. See, and that was the difference. Because they had courage, they could see beyond kind of this human current perception of things into living in God's future promise. That's what courage does. And courage also helps us see beyond fear to living in faith. Chapter 14, verse 2. All the Israelites grumbled against Moses. Back to chapter 13. 13, verse 30. Then Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, we should go up and take possession of the land, for we certainly can do it. Verse 31. But the men who had gone up with him said, we can't attack those people. They're stronger than we are. And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they had just explored. Interesting, they had just seen how wonderful it is. Now they're saying something else. They said, the land we explored devours those who live in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. So again, just more giants. And then they conclude with this. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. So we see perception of things again. Because they say, we seemed like. In our own eyes. And yet this perception of things always leads to fear. We're grasshoppers. We're grasshoppers. They are absolutely terrified. See, fear sucked whatever courage they had in them right out of them. That's what fear does. Fear sucks the courage out of us. And all that fear is just these lies. See, this lack of courage is just fueled by lies. Chapter 14, verse 3. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt? And they said to each other, we should choose a leader and go back to Egypt. Really? That's your option. After being delivered from 430 years of absolute brutality, this is what you want again. See, you know what's easy? What's easy is to be discouraged by just simply believing lies. That's easy. And most people do that. Most people are discouraged because they are simply listening to lies. All that lies are, okay, it's just this echo chamber of lies in our mind. Okay? And when we have this echo chamber of lies in our mind, then what happens is we believe falsely that every move forward or any move forward is just simply reckless. Well, faith is not reckless. But there is something about faith you need to know. To move in faith is not reckless, but it will be risky. It does require risk. The Christian life is not wrapped in bubble wrap. And yet, a lot of us, I believe, think it is. I read this article just in the last few months that really fascinated me. And it was called this: The Destructive Religion of Safetyism. The Destructive Religion of Safetyism. And what this article was basically saying was that, the general conclusion is that we've exchanged even calculated risks for safety at all costs, even if it costs us things that we're free to do and could be doing. And yet, because we've exchanged, even calculated risk for safety at all costs, we're worse off because of it. Now, I remember as a kid, way back in the day, I remember as a 5-year-old winning the citywide T-ball championships. Okay? And my friend on my team, his name was Buddy Breakwell. His dad had an El Camino with an open bed in the back. Okay? And so all these 5-year-old kids, that just won this championship jumped in the back of this open bed, this El Camino car, and tore down the street through the city to get to the celebration. We weren't wearing seatbelts. Okay, we're just packed in there like a little pile of sardines. I remember in gym class, climbing the rope. Now, some of us were terrified of that. But we loved it because our goal was, let's get to the ceiling. Okay? And we didn't have any safety lines. And so we're climbing the rope to get to the ceiling. The goal was to touch the ceiling or those massive metal frames that were holding this whole room up. I remember actually climbing on these things called monkey bars, playing tackle football at recess, and yes, even having snowball fights. But today, safetyism has eliminated all of those things. And with it, the ability for kids to learn what it means to take some risk. And the general, the conclusion, at least for our children in this article, was that because of this no risk, all safety, we have kids that have increased neuroticism and psychopathy, meaning this: we have less happy kids. We have less emotionally stable kids because we haven't taught them how to take an age-appropriate risk. So the bottom line of this article was this: you can have a safe life or you can have a full life, but you cannot have both. You can have a safe life or a full life, but you cannot have both. And then I wonder, has that attitude seeped into the church? Are we seeing that in the North American church? Because God might be looking at some of his children and seeing his children that are less joyful, that have less strength of mind, because the church has exchanged safety at all costs for risk at no cost, even the risk that's required to live for Christ. Even the risk required to live out the gospel. And so, is that something that's happened in your life? I think in the last 2 years, that's a very important question that we all need to ask ourselves individually. Have we exchanged safety at all costs for risk at no cost, even including what it means to live a gospel life for Christ? That's a question you can only answer yourself. But as I've listened to your pain and the things that have caused you the most grief over the last 2 years, that's what I hear. Because I hear things like, I needed somebody, or I knew someone that needed somebody, and yet nobody would go. Hey, everybody stayed away, even brothers and sisters of Christ. And the question is, aren't we supposed to be better than that? And that's what I hear, that we've exchanged safety at all costs for risk at no cost, even if it means not living for Christ the way that he asks us to live. See, faith is not reckless, but it is risky. I think of even my short-term missions trips. Back before I was married, I was approached with people who had guns. Danielle and I were in the middle of a gang war in Nicaragua. I had a machete pulled on me on the rooftop in Jamaica. I remember walking through Bluefields, Nicaragua with Pastor Ed Jansky. And we were walking through these back alleys and, trying to get to these homes. And Danielle and I were out in front with Pastor Ed, when all of a sudden he just looks up and says, and he's still walking, he says, "Lord, I pray that no one gets attacked and bit by a dog." And I thought, that could happen? And I don't say that to brag. All I say that is because some of you were there with me. And we've experienced these things. Some that we don't even know about. Like when we were in El Salvador years ago, and we drove through a town late at night that had a gang curfew in place. And we drove through after curfew. That was very risky. And yet we did it. So let me ask you this question. What is too risky? What risk is too great? Now, some of you are going to say, probably most of us will say, well, death. Okay, that's the greatest risk. That's what we don't want. Death. But my second question is this. Who's telling you that? Who's talking? Because death is the number one fear in our life. Fear is likely telling you that. Okay, you're afraid of dying. That's our number one fear. Fear tells us that. And yet, although we conclude that, we're also here this morning. Okay, all of us arrived at church this morning. You know, your chance of dying in a car accident is 1 in 107. And yet you're here. You jumped in a car this morning and you came to church. And so faith tells us something different. In Philippians 1 verse 21, Paul says, "For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." So the worst thing that could happen to us is not that we lose earth. That's what fear tells you. The worst thing to happen is for us to lose eternity without Christ. And so faith needs to step in. Okay, there's a point when faith needs to step in. And so in chapter 14, verse 8, Caleb says this, along with Joshua. "If the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into that land." See, that's what faith is saying. A land flowing with milk and honey, and he's going to give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord. And do not be afraid. Don't be afraid of the people of the land, because we will devour them. Their protection is gone, because the Lord is with us. So do not be afraid of them. So for Joshua and Caleb, courage wasn't missing. In fact, that was the difference. Because they had courage, they saw beyond the fear of all these people to living by faith. That's what courage does. And courage also helps us see beyond human emotions to God's reputation. In verse 10, after Caleb and Joshua say this is the response. But the whole, this is crazy, but the whole assembly talked about stoning them. Okay. But the whole assembly talked about stoning them. You know, those two guys that had a little bit of faith in their life. And this is God's response. "Then the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of meeting to all the Israelites. And the Lord said to Moses, 'How long will these people treat me with contempt? How long will they refuse to believe in me in spite of all the signs I have performed among them? I will strike them down with a plague and destroy them, but I will make you into a nation greater and stronger than they.'" Now, this is kind of amazing what's happening here. Because what God is really telling Moses is this. He's saying, "Look, Moses," here's my paraphrase. "Let me just wipe all these people out. Okay? Let's just be done with them, and I'll let you start again without them. So I'll just take them out, and you can start again." intriguing. Moses is a better man than me, because that's a pretty tempting offer. After all these people just like grumbling and complaining against you and now wanting to take your life, that's a very, very tempting offer. And yet, while the emotions have got the better of the people, Moses does not allow his emotions to get the better of him. And so here's his response in verse 13. Moses said to the Lord, "Then the Egyptians will hear about it. By your power you brought these people up from among them, and they will tell the inhabitants of this land about it. They have already heard that you, Lord, are with these people, and that you, Lord, have been seen face to face, that your cloud stays over them, and that you go before them in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. If you put all these people to death, leaving none alive, the nations who have heard this report about you will say, the Lord was not able to bring these people into the land he promised them an oath, so he slaughtered them in the wilderness." This is what Moses is telling God. He said, God, nope, can't do this, because this is about your reputation. This is about you. This is about your reputation in this land and beyond. And so in verse 17, now may the Lord's strength be displayed just as you declared. The Lord is slow to anger, abounding in love, forgiving sin and rebellion. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation. In accordance with your great love, forgive the sin of these people, just as you have pardoned them from the time they left Egypt until now. Moses looks at God and says, God, tempting offer, but this is about your reputation. See, if he let his emotions get the best of him, then there'd be consequences. And actually, it's consequences that these people face because they let their emotions get the best of them. So in verse 20, this is what happens to these people who just responded emotionally. Verse 20 says, the Lord replied, I have forgiven them, as you asked. Nevertheless, as surely as I live, and as surely as the glory of the Lord fills the whole earth, not one of those who saw my glory and the signs I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, but who disobeyed me and tested me 10 times, not one of them will ever see the land. They're going to see it, never live. Not one of them will ever see the land I promised on oath to their ancestors. No one who has treated me with contempt will ever see it. See, because they didn't live for God's reputation, but just simply their emotions, they had consequences because of that. And the consequences were those people are never, ever going to live in the best. They'll only ever hear about it. And the consequences actually get worse for them. Because once they hear this from God, in verse 39 down to the bottom of chapter 14, they actually say, okay, oh no, God's upset. Let's go take the land. Let's go. And all these guys go to try to take the land, another emotional response. And they all die there. See, you know what's easy? Is to let our discouragement mount by just not trusting God. To let our discouragement mount by letting our emotions fly. And the consequences with it. And yet there's Caleb. In verse 24, God says, "But because my servant Caleb has a different spirit and follows me wholeheartedly, I will bring him into the land. I will bring him into the land he went to." See, he didn't just see it, he will live in it. "I will bring him into the land he went to, and his descendants will inherit it." See, there is no courage without a heart that fully rests and relies on God, who goes with us and who ultimately accomplishes his promises. There is no courage without a heart that rests and relies on him. And so for Caleb and Joshua, courage wasn't missing. And that was the difference. See, they were able to see beyond just these human emotions and to live for God's reputation. God's best is always going to be missed when courage is. In Burma, there was a man that lived there for a while named David Eubank. And David Eubank was a missionary kid. I think he grew up in Thailand or the Philippines. I got all these Old Testament tribes in my head now. He went to the U.S. Army and then retired from there. Went back to Burma with his family. And Burma was experiencing a civil war that had been decades and decades and decades long. And as a person of faith, going back into Burma with his family, he saw all that was happening to these people. And he concluded to himself, as a person of faith, as someone that follows Christ and lives for the gospel, I can't let this happen. These people need me. And I will live for them just like Jesus lived for me, even if it means that I got to lay down my life for them. Because that's what a Christ follower does. A Christ follower is prepared to lay down his life for others. So he went into this place of incredible risk. He helped all these people to protect them, to deliver them from their oppression. And he did it the whole time with his wife and 4 kids. And when you go to his website called the Free Burma Rangers, in his mission statement, the very second thing he says is this: we act with courage. He has to. To live for Christ, he had to do that. And you have to do that. You have to do that in your life. So where is it in your life that you need to show true courage? Where is it in your life that the picture of God's best isn't being lived out? Is it in your marriage? Is it in other relationships? Is it in your neighborhood? With your neighbors? Is it in your workplace? Okay, what's the scenario? When you ask God that question, what does he tell you? Where is it in your life that the picture of God's best isn't being lived out? Where is it? Well, we all might have a different answer, but there's going to be one common thread. The answer to all of your questions is wherever the gospel is not being seen and lived out. If the gospel is not being seen and lived out in your marriage, that's where you need to show courage. If the gospel is not being seen and lived out with your neighbors, That's where you need courage. And God's calling us to that. God's calling us to be a people of courage because He has the best. He has the best for us. He has the best for others. And yet it's always missed when courage is. That's the difference. That's the difference. And so where is it that God is pointing you to say you need to show courage here? To live for my future promise. To live in faith. To live for His reputation. God's calling us to do it. Let's pray. God, today we thank You for, again, just this reminder. I trust that's what it's been. We need to be people of courage, God. A courage that can see beyond things with our own eyes and just that trust Your promises, that know what You say to be true. That see beyond the fear and just live by faith and belief in who You are, what You will accomplish through us. And ultimately, those people that live for Your reputation and don't respond emotionally, which is so easy for all of us to do. It's easy to be discouraged. It's so easy for us to do that because we perceive things humanly. We have fears in our life fueled by lies. And we certainly have emotional responses because we just think earth is all that matters. So God, where is it that we need to be courageous? Where is it that You need just to poke us and show us that this is where it needs to be for You? It's always where the gospel is not seen and lived out. And that is the ultimate issue. I pray that we be a people who live the gospel, who model the gospel, who display people so that they can see it and want to live it themselves. That's an awesome responsibility, but God, You go with us. And because of that, because of what You are going to do, we can have courage. And we ask that we would be assured of Your presence with us so that we can do that today. And we thank You and pray in Your name. Amen.